I've been given a very broad canvas to speak on. I want to begin by saying, how much I appreciate what you're doing here at Trinity West, and how actually, in terms of your identity, you're in a situation where you're engaging with two communities with quite different agendas. The general academic community, which is suspicious of any engagement of faith and scholarship, and also church pastors who are suspicious, at least some of them are, of any engagement of Christian mind with things that academic disciplines are dealing with. And this is particularly important in both cases in the relationship of science. Because in many ways, a sort of rather uncritical scientism is very characteristic of Western culture at the moment. And it's not very well passed. It's not as if people sit down and think this through. It's this sort of gut feeling that science is able to answer all of life's big questions, and therefore anybody else is simply getting in the way. And why should anybody else talk, for example, about questions which either seem to call into question the competence of science, or more generally to say maybe there's more to be said about this than what science is actually saying. And of course, the question of human flourishing is a very good example of this. And so I think we just need to begin by reflecting on the context. I'm not going to say very much about that, but it is, I think, a very important issue for you all to bear in mind. But scientism is, I think, something that does need to be reflected on. And in his lectures, The Abolition of Man, which I think if I had to nominate Lewis's worst-selling book, it's either this or The Pilgrim's Regress, and that is the case because these are quite difficult books. But in the case of The Abolition of Man, Lewis is reflecting on what it means to be human. And he's in effect concerned that you define human existence, human significance out of existence, by in fact saying, well, of course, we have emotions, but this is just caused by chemicals and so on. So, whatever you think, whatever you are, whatever you do can be explained away on a purely scientific basis, and therefore, in effect, there's no significance to human nature. So Lewis, in that book, is really reflecting on the vulnerability of scientism as an academic philosophy, but also the vulnerability of human nature to people who take on this way of thinking without giving it due critical reflection. So I want to reflect a little bit on what Lewis has to say on these questions. Lewis, as a young man, was an atheist, and he was an atheist for, I think, two main reasons. One was that he was convinced that suffering was really a completely unresolvable problem. And this was exaggerated, I think, or exacerbated by his experience during the First World War when he fought in the British Army and was quite severely wounded. But for our purposes this morning, more importantly, he felt that science was the dominant philosophy of his day, talking about the 1910s, and that in effect science simply eroded the conceptual space normally allowed to religion. And so Lewis is really aware from the outset that science is a big problem for faith. Then, as you all know, Lewis goes up to Oxford, initially to study classics, then to study English, and begins to reflect on these questions in more detail and in conversation with his colleagues. And I think one of the things he begins to realize is that his attitude to science actually does need quite significant revision. And there are a number of themes that emerge in Lewis's thinking. One, of course, is the whole issue of scientific revisionism. That's to say that science may think this at point A in its history, but then either through theoretical development or the appearance of new evidence, it moves away and thinks this instead. And these are the kind of issues that Michael Polanyi talks about in his book, Personal Knowledge. How can you be a scientist, in effect, believing certain things to be true and yet knowing perfectly well that in a generation's time some of those will be shown to be wrong, but you aren't yet sure which those are going to be. And Lewis became aware of this and so felt some sort of greater modesty was required in this particular area. But Lewis was also very much aware of the way in which science became attached to philosophical positions. And therefore, Lewis, in effect, initially thinking that some kind of naturalism, materialism was inevitable if you were a scientist, begins to see these are essentially philosophical extensions of natural science, which are not necessarily a part of the natural sciences themselves. And that theme is developed more recently by Alvin Plantinga, but there's no doubt in my mind where he gets those ideas from. So I think that is a very important point to bear in mind. I think we see this in thinking about Lewis on evolution. So let's just think through what Lewis says on evolution. First point that Lewis makes, particularly in some of his letters, is that he thinks evolution is just absolutely implausible. In other words, he finds it very, very difficult to get his mind around it. How could this happen in this way? I mean, he just sees it as being very, very difficult to take in. But he then says, but the evidence is there, and therefore we have to get used to the fact that it may seem to us to be very implausible, but it does seem to be the best explanation we have. And so Lewis is not an enthusiastic advocate of evolution at all. He's simply saying this seems to be the way the science is going, and I have no objection to that, but I do have objection, this is the point I really want to emphasize, to metaphysical interpretations, to metaphysical inflation of the idea of evolution. In other words, the distinction he makes between evolution as a simple phenomenon, or provisional scientific theory, and evolutionism, his word, which is in effect a philosophy based around the observation of evolution. So I think Lewis is basically saying we can in effect take on board the scientific theory of evolution. The problem really is what people do with this, the kind of moral or metaphysical or philosophical conclusions they draw from this. So to show Lewis's wisdom in this, I want to talk about Richard Dawkins for a few moments. Richard Dawkins, at some points in his writings, is very, very clear that Darwinism is a provisional scientific theory which may be shown to be wrong. So we look, for example, at his collection of essays called The Devil's Chaplain, which came out, I think, in 2003. And there's one of those essays in which he is absolutely clear, in 100 years' time, new evidence may emerge, which means we have to radically modify Darwinism so it will no longer be recognizable or abandon it altogether for something that seems to make more sense of the evidence. So there you see Dawkins actually speaking as an empirical scientist, aware that science, in effect, does go through what Thomas Kuhn famously calls paradigm shifts, when in effect the received view is found to be inadequate, and after a period of turmoil, something better comes in and takes its place. But then there are points in Dawkins' writings where he seems almost to ignore that. And those are the parts in which he talks about what he calls universal Darwinism. Universal Darwinism is, in effect, a worldview. It is a metaphysical system. It is based on the empirical phenomenon of evolution, but actually it's become almost independent of that. It's become, in effect, a worldview which, in effect, says there cannot be a God, that ethics are simply a byproduct of some sort of human process which you don't really fully understand, but they do not need to be taken seriously, and so on. And one of the things I want to say is actually when you read Lewis first and then read Dawkins, you can see how wise Lewis is. Lewis is saying that it is very, very easy to take a scientific theory and then to expand it, to inflate it. So in effect, although to an outsider it still looks the same thing, in fact it's been replaced by something deeper. Now, next year in November, we observe the 100th anniversary of the confirmation of Einstein's theory of relativity. As you probably know, some British scientists managed to do some observations which seemed to confirm it. And the only reason it took so long to do so was because the First World War, which prevented scientists from getting to the right places to observe these eclipses. But here's the point I want to make. What did British intellectual culture make of Einstein's theory of relativity? The answer is they read it in two ways. Number one, it meant time travel was possible. Now, those of you who are physicists can probably work out how that misunderstanding arose, but it is a misunderstanding. Much more importantly, listen to this. Einstein's theory of relativity proves absolutely scientifically the moral relativism which we all think is right. Relativity, relativism. In other words, you can see how a scientific theory is being A, misread, and B, used to bolster a philosophical position which comes from somewhere completely different. And that's one of the things I want to say, that actually one of the things that Lewis is warning us about is, in effect, people who misinterpret the sciences, who usually are not scientists. It's usually other people who, in effect, not quite understanding the science, make it say something that it's not saying at all. And that's why I think it's extremely important that here at TW there are scientists who are in effect able to reflect more widely on what science is all about, making connections with faith, but also actually making connections with cultural interpretations of science, which very often are developed by people with quite definite agendas in mind. So I come back to the whole theme of scientism, which is a philosophy which basically privileges the natural sciences, or say that scientific answers are the only answers that can be given to life's meaningful questions. I want to emphasize that Lewis does engage these questions, though he does not use that word scientism, except I think at one point, where it's clearly a word he's not quite at ease with. But he does deal with the questions that lie behind this. And so I want to make connections with the whole question of human flourishing, which of course has come up quite clearly in the general context for this discussion. And it allows me to really transition into a discussion of the relationship between science and faith. And clearly there are many things that could be said here. One point is historical, that in effect what is now called the conflict narrative is increasingly being seen by scholars, and I'll emphasize that word, as a social production of the 1870s in response to the needs of that situation. It involves exaggeration, it involves a certain privileged group trying to assert cultural authority. And the key point I want to make is that modern scholarship basically says two things. Number one, there is no pattern. There's no pattern in the interaction of science and religion down the ages. You can see lots of different things happening, but there is no big picture at all. And therefore, those who say there is one narrative that is able to do this, in effect, are simply using a golden thread argument, i.e., you have a complex history and say, I'll use that, I'll use that, I'll use that, I'll link them all together, and that's what history is all about. But you leave out, very often, things that complexify. That's a very important point. Example, Christopher Hitchens' book, God's Not Great. Think of his illustration of smallpox vaccination to show that religious people are lousy scientists and get in the way of scientific progress. Timothy Dwight, in 1790, a Christian professor at Yale, famously said smallpox vaccination is simply wrong. And he leaves it there. One example, one anecdote, that's it. But let me give two other anecdotes. Number one, Jonathan Edwards, president of Princeton, died wanting to show his students that smallpox vaccination was safe. And so he said, inoculate me, and it went wrong. So, there's a bit of the narrative that he's leaving out. And we might also move to the 20th century, where we find that some very prominent atheists of that period, George Bernard Shaw being a classic example, who in 1930 said smallpox vaccination was fraudulent, you shouldn't do it. And that led to a rise in smallpox in England at the time. So the key point is, with two counter-examples, I have A, complexified the narrative, and B, shown that Chris Hitchens is simply utterly simplistic. So there is no overall big picture, and B, read Peter Harrison, John Hedley-Brooke, if there is a dominant theme, it is simply that of collaboration, enrichment. That's it. It isn't actually beyond 50% mark. It's lower than that. But the point is, it's there. And that, I think, is very important. Either there's no conversation to be had, or it's a tense conversation, or it's an enriching conversation. And the enriching bit is is the biggest of the three. So we need to say that to our students, that this thing they're picking up from popular culture is simply based on outdated scholarship by people who do not want their view to be changed. That's a very important point to make. But I think there is something else, really, that we do need to say here, and it's this. That one of the things that C.S. Lewis is saying, which is actually very important for the dialogue between faith and science in general, is the different levels at which these work. Levels. I'm using that word deliberately. What I'm trying to say is you can answer questions at different levels, and that those answers might not be contradictory. Richard Dawkins says a scientific explanation is always right and will always win out, and that means that any other explanations are wrong. But you can easily give explanations that are not scientific. The example I will give in a lecture of mine at Regent College, it comes from a colleague of mine who, back in England, who eventually became president of Cornell University, who said, look, imagine somebody boiling a kettle. Why is a kettle boiling? Well, energy conversion, yes, that's a scientific explanation, but also I felt like I would like a cup of tea, so I boiled the kettle. And those are, both explanations are right. You see that? They're both part of a bigger picture. Taken together, they give you a richer understanding of why the kettle's boiling. If Dawkins is right, it's the energy conversion explains it, end of discussion. It's not like that. But more importantly, there's this question of meaning. I want to focus on this. It's all about well-being. Let's take a good example. Let's look at Roy Baumeister's book, okay, Meanings of Life. From a social psychological perspective, he's saying, not here's a theory of life. What he's saying is, what sort of things does a theory of meaning of life have to engage? He says, look, it has to engage things like questions of identity. Who am I really? Question of purpose. Why am I here? Question of agency. Can I make a difference? And also, question of value, not just what's good, but actually, do I matter? He's saying you've got to touch on those four themes if you're going to live a meaningful life. And I want to say to you that science actually can touch on each of those themes, giving you partial answers. But there's an awful lot more that needs to be said. And one of the points that Lewis keeps on banging home is that one of the big things about Christianity is it gives you a framework for generating meaning. Not arbitrary meaning. Hey, in the post-truth era, I'm going to believe this, and that's right. It's much more, no. This is a big picture which is grounded in reality. Once you buy into this big picture, certain things begin to emerge from it, and they're right. And what Lewis is saying is gives you a framework for constructing values and also understanding your personal meaning. Now, psychologists, and I'm sure there's many here who want to elaborate on this, but psychologists, I think, have been very good at helping us to understand how important the idea of a big picture is to human stability and well-being. But psychology doesn't really say, well, meaning is important, and by the way, the meaning of life is this. And that's not really what empirical science is able to do. But it does help us understand that as human beings, these questions really matter. And I often think of Jeanette Winterson's recent, it's almost like an autobiographical memoir, but it has this wonderful title, which I'm very jealous of, which I thought, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? Wonderful. But in one of her chapters, she says, look, we cannot rest simply with eating and sleeping and reproducing because we are meaning-seeking animals. Now, I want you to remember that. Because what I'm saying is that's an integral question of what it means to be a human being. It's not just about understanding how our world and we work, okay? It's something deeper. And the question of meaning is really important. That's why I think colleges like TWU are so important, because you can, in effect, bring these things together, okay? That's very important. You can actually, whether you do it by having this here and that there, but the two are able to converse somehow, or, and this is a very important point, whether in certain individual professors you have somebody who has already done this process of integration and can say, here's how I've done it. Elaine Eklund, a sociologist at Rice University, has done a lot of empirical and ethnographical work on attitudes towards science and religion. One rather nice little piece she did about 3 years ago was to do with what is it that makes people think, hey, you can hold science and faith together. Say, for example, against the arguments of Richard Dawkins. And what they found was this. It's not so much saying, here are the arguments that show that this is not the case. That actually you can hold science and faith together. That Dawkins might be wrong. It is knowing somebody who has brought these together and holds them together. And then they say, hey, she does it. I can do it. It's that sort of thing. So what I want to say is actually Eklund's research really validates the importance of places like TWU. It also accentuates the importance of individual academics who've said, here's how I've seen it. Here's how I've done this. Can that help you do the same? So I'm ending now. I'm ending you by just emphasizing the importance of mentorship. I mean, I wouldn't say C.S. Lewis is my mentor. I love him, but I never knew him, okay? I didn't meet him. But I did meet somebody called Charles Coulson. The Coulson in question is a professor of theoretical chemistry at Oxford, who happened to be a fellow of the Oxford College, which I was an undergraduate. And in 1972 or 3, I can't remember exactly which it was, he preached a sermon. He was a Methodist lay preacher on how he held his science and his faith together. And in that 10-minute sermon, he gave me a framework. And it's a framework I use to this day, even though I've kind of elaborated on it. I talked to him a bit about it, but basically, he gave me something as a starting point, which proved to be a very good starting point, and showed me it could be done, and I've used it ever since. How many people are you going to help do exactly the same thing? That really is the question. And that's why I think that this institution has such potential for doing that. It also, I think, it reinforces the point, not simply the institution, but individual academics. Because people are looking for wisdom. And very often, the wise are those who've thought about this longer and can then say, here's what I found. Does this help you get started?